Good evening. We're going to find out today how labour relations are in dear old Blighty. And if you're not old enough to know what that means, it means the United Kingdom. But first, here's Ted with the rundown.
How real is a refugee crisis? New federal legislation is supposed to allow legitimate refugees into Canada while remaining compassionate to all who apply. Webster finds out how effective the changes have been with Dr. Stanley Knight, chairman of the Vancouver Refugee Council. But first, when it comes to strikes, some say Canadian unions are amateurs. What happens in Britain? Tonight, Webster gets the facts on the UK's labour scene from Professor George Bain, labour expert and arbitrator.
Dr. Bain, as a matter of fact, is a Canadian who went to Britain in the early 60s. And I want to put it straight to you. Is Maggie Thatcher a disaster as an industrial relations architect? Or has she done any good? Because all we ever see are vast riots with police and strikers on the telly.
Well, she's a bit of both. She certainly brought about some very dramatic changes in industrial relations, not just on Fleet Street and in mining and one or two other places. She's brought some dramatic changes, but the changes have had a price, and the price has been a good deal of tearing of the social and constitutional fabric, and that's perhaps what's got covered in Canada.
Well, some years ago, I know there was very little in the way of labour law in Britain. It was no contract, walk away. What has she done that's different?
Well, the position you started from is absolutely correct. 20 years ago, when I went to Britain, for example, it was the least regulated system of industrial relations in the world. Today, it probably could claim to be one of the most regulated. And she's brought in a whole framework of laws since 1979, 3 major pieces of legislation. If she's re-elected in the next year or so, when she will undoubtedly go to the polls, she'll bring in a 4th piece of legislation. She's brought in balloting for strikes. She's brought in balloting for officers to get elected. She's brought in ballots to have a closed shop. She's brought in reduced immunity for strikes, so political strikes are now illegal, inter-union disputes are illegal, secondary disputes, secondary picketing is illegal, and she's just brought in laws as well which remove much of the support for collective bargaining.
In other words, many of the laws we have now in various Canadian provinces are new to Britain but seen on a bigger scale.
That's absolutely true. If somebody had gone to Britain 20 years ago, they would have found it a very strange system. If they went today from Canada, knowing the Canadian system, they would find many, many similarities.
Before we get back to the detail of some of your more dramatic strikes, if a man who was described by the editor of the Sunday Express on this program as a Welsh windbag, Kinnock, the Labour leader, is he Labour? Yeah.
Yes, he is Labour.
If he becomes Prime Minister, will he scrap the lot?
He won't scrap the lot, but he'll certainly keep the balloting legislation because, ironically, I think the balloting legislation has turned out to be helpful to the trade unions. They've got a legitimacy now. They claim to be representative. It's much harder for the government, for employers to say they're not speaking for their members because on almost every issue they have to ballot them before they actually speak. So he'll certainly keep that, but he will sweep away other parts of it and perhaps introduce other aspects.
Secret balloting for permission from the executive to strike a union.
That is correct.
Has that got to be on the last offer, or can it be on before any offer at all?
No, it's got to be within 4 weeks of the strike.
But they must have received an offer.
There'll be an offer, yes.
Now, balloting for union positions, why was that? Was it a suspicion that perhaps ballots were being rigged or fixed?
Not so much rigged or fixed, but officials were appointed in many cases for life, and they didn't have to stand for election at all, or in some cases they stood once and then they were in for life.
Was that the case of Scargill?
It's certainly the case of Scargill, and there's even a loophole with Scargill. The law as it stands at the moment only applies to members of the executive who have a vote. The miners' union changed the rules to deny the president of the union a vote. Mrs. Thatcher has just announced she will amend the legislation if she's re-elected, which will mean that any member of the executive, voting or non-voting, will have to stand for election.
So Scargill can't take Britain through the coal strike from which it suffered so severely, with many of the miners wanting to go to work and being hammered by Scargill's supporters.
Well, he, even if the legislation wasn't changed, I don't think would be able to do that again because he split the union. There's a breakaway union, And just before leaving Britain a few days ago, the Welsh miners were defying Scargill. Arthur Scargill has probably done more to damage the miners' cause than Mrs. Thatcher has.
Mind you, I can well understand, and I saw a couple of villages in Scotland where they came along and said, you've got good mines, but we're going to close them because we can bring in cheaper coal from Poland. And these guys were losing their entire reason for existence and didn't want to move.
Well, it's not just that, I think, Jack. As you say, it's whole communities. The mining community, as you well know, coming from Scotland, tends to be very much connected with certain communities in certain areas. And hence, it was not just people losing their jobs. In many respects, it was also people losing their communities, their schools, their whole future.
Now, during the recent Battle of Wapping, let me see if I got it right. The Sunday Times and the Times just fired 5,000 people.
That is absolutely right.
Were they entitled to do that?
Yes, as long as you fire everybody who's on strike, that is legal.
And that was an illegal strike, was it?
It wasn't so much an illegal strike as they would simply not accept the final offer which Murdoch, the proprietor of the two papers, was making.
And now, if I refuse to accept that offer and I am fired, the employer is entitled to bring in scabs.
Yes.
And the police to make sure the scabs get there.
Well, certainly whether he's entitled to bring in the police, I'm not so sure, but the police tend to be used to maintain order and stability and to allow people to go through the picket lines, and that's what's happened.
I don't want to give the wrong impression. Labour relations in the main in Britain, how would you describe them? Using an adjective, calm or quiet? Or?
Very calm, very quiet. In 1979, there was 30 million man days lost as a result of strikes. Last year, there were 2 million. There's no doubt what you hear in Canada are the exceptional set-piece strikes, like the miners, like Wapping, like Fleet Street more generally. But in general, industrial relations in Britain is much quieter at the moment than it is in Canada, and certainly in British Columbia.
Now, in British Columbia, I think I'm right in this, if we have a strike and there's, before anyone can sue anybody for civil damages, you got to get permission of the Labour Board. And of course, all kinds of little deals are made that the strike will be settled, providing all charges are dropped.
Right.
Does that happen in Britain?
No, there is no Labour Board as such, and employers simply go to the courts and sue if they're so minded.
How tough are the courts, for instance, during the newspaper strikes recently?
They've been very, very tough, and they have laid down very large fines, in many cases sequestering the assets of unions and crippling them financially. Certainly unions, contrary to what people thought, have begun to obey the courts because the financial consequences of not doing so have brought them to the brink of bankruptcy.
Do I recall a $1 million fine for contempt of court against the National Graphic Union, NGA?
The printers, the skilled printers, there's been very large fines. The same was true with the miners. The same was true with the Transport and General Workers Union, which is the largest union in Britain, and also the Amalgamated Engineering Union. So there have been fines of very, very large sums.
Like many multi-millions of pounds.
Yes, hundreds of thousands of pounds.
But do the unions get the money back if they behave themselves?
No, they lose it.
Have many of them lost large sums of money?
Many of them have lost large sums and have actually lost it rather than forgo a point of principle.
So the radical change in Britain over the past 20, 25 years has really been extraordinary.
It's been extraordinary. The major question is whether it's permanent. One thing which has been crucial to Mrs. Thatcher is unemployment at 14 or 15% in Britain, which makes it one of the highest levels of unemployment in the world. And if there hadn't been that level of unemployment, which greatly weakened trade unions, I think it's highly questionable whether or not she would have been able to get these policies through effectively.
Now, the TUC, as I recall, which is the overall body, is it not?
Like the CLC here.
Like the CLC, did not support Scargill and the miners, did it?
That's absolutely right, they did not.
And yet they were able to come to Canada, the miners, and could get money from the BC Fed and the Canadian bodies here. Did that surprise you?
It surprises me a bit that they were able to get money from the Canadian labour movement. The reason the TUC did not support them, and the reason that many other trade unions did not support them, is that Arthur Scargill was not able to get all his own members to support him. About a third of his membership refused to support the strike. And the view taken by other trade unions was, well, when you get your member to support the strike, then come and ask us for support.
So just to sum up, Maggie has been very tough.
That's absolutely true.
Very effective.
in the short run.
Do you think it'll last the long run, even if she stays in power, or will it create strikes and battles with the police?
I think it will create not so much strikes and battles with the police. I think that may be a phase we've just about gone through. I think what it has done is politicize industrial relations. It's made industrial relations a political football. And if the government were to change, and there's certainly going to be an election within the next 12 months, I think there are many, many people in the Labour Party, particularly activists, who would expect Mr. Kinnock and his colleagues to be as forthright, determined, and principled in supporting the Labour point of view as Mrs. Thatcher has been.
And then again, because of the dissatisfaction among the rank and file, Kinnock might lose out. Maybe the union rank and file want the toughness.
Well, they may want toughness, but I think the general feeling is that the rank and file is always opposed to other people's strikes. They're not necessarily opposed to their own strikes.
A pleasure to talk to George S. Bain, who's here to speak to the Vancouver Institute on Saturday at the UBC on industrial relations, conflict or cooperation. And he's going to take some phone calls from you on the topic after the break. Couple of other basic questions. Is there a minimum wage in Britain?
No, there used to be a minimum wage in certain industries, but not generally as there is in Canada. But Mrs. Thatcher reduced the coverage of that.
Now, what about certification? Is it 50% plus one with a supervised government strike vote to become a recognized, valid, legitimate trade union?
There is no certification legislation in Britain. If a union wants to get recognized, it has to have sufficient strength or persuasive argument to compel or persuade an employer.
But I've got to sign up the men first.
They have to sign up the men, or very often these days, of course, in services, it's signing up the women. But they don't necessarily have to sign 50%.
But what about it when it comes to dues? Union check-off? The government taking the dues off?
There's certainly the government doesn't take the dues off.
I mean the employer.
But the employer does, but that's not compulsory either. I mean, the union may negotiate a check-off.
Closed shop, hiring halls.
There are very few hiring halls left. The seamen have a hiring hall.
But she hasn't wiped out the closed shop.
She has required a ballot in which unions have to get over 80% before you can introduce a closed shop. And she's just published a green paper, a consultative paper, saying that she will outlaw the closed shop if re-elected.
Well, that's not right to work.
It's not right to work, but...
she will allow the union shop.
No, she will allow no compulsion to join a trade union, whether it be the union shop or the closed shop.
Or the RAND formula would
Or the
apply
RAND
at
formula.
all.
The RAND formula would not apply.
Well, I hope Van der Sam isn't listening too closely tonight, and we're in for a rugged season, I'll tell you.
Well, in the 1970s, when Heath was the Prime Minister, he sent a team over to Canada and the United States to see what they could learn to help him. I think if somebody was going to reform industrial relations from a conservative perspective in in Canada or the United States today, they could come to Britain and perhaps find a few lessons.
Go ahead to Dr. Bain.
Oh, good afternoon, Dr. Bain. I listened to you, and when you start talking about the politicization of labor relations in Britain, you seem a little anxious to it. I wish that in your speech on Saturday that you'll send that message across, because I'm very worried about the politicization of labor relations in this province. I hear the comment quite often, I'd like you to comment on, that people are now saying, you know, there was a time when unions were necessary in society, but they've long outgrown their usefulness, and it's time to really put the clamp on them. I'd like to hear what your opinion is on statements like that.
Good.
Well, I don't think unions have outgrown their usefulness. Unions tend to be an offspring of the private enterprise or capitalist system. And as long as we have a system in which there are conflicts of interest, and there clearly are conflicts of interest within enterprises, you need some form of collective representation. I think unions are very, very essential.
Is it your opinion that a closed shop is an anti-democratic process?
I don't see it so much as an anti-democratic process. I think the trouble with the closed shop issue is that A, people get very emotional about it, and B, they tend not to see two conflicting principles. You have one group saying that the highest principle is individual freedom, and you have another group saying, yes, but people should pay for what they receive, namely better benefits, better wages, and so on. And I think that Chief Justice Rand, all those years ago in Canada, and it's one of the main inventions, if you like, of Canadian industrial relations, which has been exported abroad, namely the Rand formula or the agency shop, whereby you actually pay your dues, but you don't join the union, is a useful compromise.
Go ahead, please, to Dr. Bain.
Dr. Bain, could you briefly outline the collective bargaining process in Britain? Is it done at the industry, regional, or company-by-company level?
It's changed very, very greatly over the last 20 years. 20 years ago, it was mainly done at industry level. And today, it would be very, very similar to Canada. It would be done at company and increasingly plant level. Probably, actually, British Columbia, with its industry-wide bargaining in many areas, was more similar to Britain as it was 20 years ago than today.
Go ahead, please.
Dr. Bain, has Mrs. Thatcher's policy and efforts had any practical results? For instance, has it restored shipbuilding on the Clyde?
It certainly has not restored shipbuilding on the Clyde, nor shipbuilding anywhere else in Britain. In fact, one of the certainly negative aspects of Mrs. Thatcher's policy is, as I mentioned when Jack was putting questions, is it's only really been possible against the background of very, very high unemployment. Unemployment has leapt from about 5% in 1979 to 14 or 15% today.
Can you give me offhand what the average settlement is today, if there's any kind of average you can take from industry?
Yes, I mean, average wage settlement.
Yeah.
The going rate at the moment is about 5 to 6%.
That's higher than here, I think. Go ahead from Trail.
Yes, thank you. To Dr. Bain, the unemployment rate you have just spoken about is high, and I think it's a lot easier to see that in even where we live here in BC when it comes to breaking strikes and policy set down by government using the unemployment rate because people do have to work. Don't you find that everywhere?
Well, you may find it everywhere, but certainly if we look at the last attempt in Britain to change the system of industrial relations, which was also a Conservative Prime Minister, Mr. Heath, in the early 1970s, he failed, I think, primarily because he did not first change the balance of power. Mrs. Thatcher has used legislation as a secondary force. She's used economics as the primary force.
Yeah. Go ahead from Nanaimo.
Yeah, good afternoon, Jack. I'd like to ask Dr. Bain if he sees any alternative to the present system of collective bargaining by using a system such as final offer selection as a case in point.
Well, I don't see final offer selection or final offer arbitration as an alternative to collective bargaining. It's one of the ways of resolving a dispute that may arise in collective bargaining. And final offer arbitration, or it's sometimes called in Britain pendulum arbitration, has its uses, particularly in the public sector.
Every political leader in this country, without throwing any particular aspersions, comes into office determined to find a new way for peaceful industrial harmony and cooperation for the good of all of the inhabitants of the province. They're whistling Dixie, aren't they?
I think they are, in the sense that people are always looking for panaceas. I don't think there are panaceas in industrial relations. I also think that conflict, as well as cooperation, but conflict is inherent in the system, and probably the negative consequences of it are greatly exaggerated.
Oh, well, I don't know. If we had a 5.5-month strike with the IWA last year, it cost us $2 billion, and in my humble opinion, it could have been settled in 3 days.
Well, it may have. I don't know the background to that strike.
No,
it may have been
not.
settled in 3 days. But when you say it cost $2 million...
$2 billion
$2 billion.
Week. $2 billion.
How would you measure that?
Number of days' work lost, the industrial output lost, the
But how much of it can you
exports
make
lost.
up?
You can't make it up. Well, you can make up the productive factor, but you can't make up the wages.
Oh, you can't make up the wages, no. Well, you could in the longer term.
In the longer term. Meanwhile, people lose their houses, starve to death. Well, they don't starve to death. That's journalistic exaggeration. Go ahead, please.
Dr. Bain, is it not a fact that a lot of the trouble has stemmed from the fact, from the fact that workers were not prepared to adopt modern techniques, particularly so far as the mopping situation was concerned? And secondly, that there was very serious overmanning for many years in some of the major industries.
Well, in the case of Wapping or Fleet Street generally, there's no doubt that the key issue in the dispute was manning and new technology, namely whether or not journalists would be allowed to input their own copy directly through the computer rather than through the traditional compositors. But I think in general, one could exaggerate the amount of overmanning or overstaffing that existed in British industry. But having said that, one of the main outcomes, I think, of industrial relations policy since 1979 is what in Britain is referred to as labor flexibility. There's much, much greater flexibility of labor. What were regarded as restrictive practices are much fewer, and basically workforces have been very dramatically slimmed down.
Management still has the right to manage.
Well, they have the right to manage in as much as they're able to convince unions that they have that right.
Go ahead, please.
Hello. I wanted to ask Dr. Bain why it is in the United Kingdom that you find mining unions are far more radicalized than other unions?
Mining unions?
Yes, mining unions.
Well, I think you may not only find that in the United Kingdom. Generally speaking, it's argued that mining unions, to some extent logging, forestry trade unions, etc., tend to be more militant. The reasons usually given sort of come in a cluster, something to do with the danger of the occupation, the fact, as Jack and I were discussing earlier, that people live in concentrated communities which develop their own norms, their own principles, and traditions, and it's these factors, perhaps more than mining itself, which tends to produce the militancy. And as I said, I'd be very surprised if that isn't true in the United States, Canada, and most other countries. Miners tend to be militant.
Economic pressure, however, tends to reduce feather bedding so the jobs will continue, doesn't it?
Certainly, economic pressure has made Britain more productive in the last few years.
Well, to coin a phrase, you've been a mine of useful information. My thanks to Dr. Bain, who's doing the Ida Green lecture for the Vancouver Institute Saturday night at UBC. Thanks again, Doc.
Thank you.
I'll be back after the break. Everybody feels sorry for legitimate refugees, especially those stuck someplace not knowing what's going to happen to them next. Here is Dr. Stanley Knight, Chairman of the Vancouver Refugee Council. You're on an appointee to the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And, you know, people do not understand this refugee position and think that many of them are just trying to slip into this country as economic migrants who never were in fear or terror of anything except losing a job.
That's true. There are some people that are in that category.
There are many like that, are there?
Well, there are some people who estimate that there are a large percentage of them are.
Should we, I mean, you're obviously a very compassionate fellow, and I am on a good day too. Should we just not open the door and let them all in?
I think we have to recognize Canada's sovereignty, and we also have to recognize our own social and economic positions. We can't, there are possibly 10, 15 million refugees in the world, and we can't possibly look after all of them, but we should figure out how many we can look after and then legitimately do that. We've been doing that in the past, but conditions have changed.
Well, conditions haven't changed that much, have you? This government hasn't changed the policies, really, except to make it a little bit more difficult to get in for your immigration hearing. Is that right?
No, the most dramatic shift is that in the past, the Canadian officials used to go abroad and, in cooperation with the United Nations, interview candidates and select people and then bring them back to Canada as refugees.
That was a good way to do that.
Well, it worked and it was very effective.
We did that with the Vietnamese.
Yes, sir. Yes, we did.
We did it with other people.
Yes.
But then along came the Turks and the Portuguese, pretending to be refugees, who weren't refugees at all, and the Tamils in the lifeboats, who were not refugees either, and upset reasonably the ordinary Canadian man in the street, didn't they?
That's true. It's like everything else along with government, that people throughout Canada are upset with people involved in rip-offs or taking advantage of the system, when in fact, when we have people who are unemployed or we have limited funds around, nobody wants to see people getting rich for nothing or taking advantage of the system. And the same thing is true with regards to immigrants. There are people waiting in line who are going through all the legitimate procedures with regards to coming to Canada. And then if you see somebody else who arrives and they come in and they claim refugee status, and in fact they may have been in line with you in your home country prior, and they just didn't want to go through that process, then they're understandably upset.
All right. On the West Coast, we've had nothing like the pressure from those people who want to leave the United States as they've had at Buffalo and in Toronto. What's the pressure here, and what happens to these people?
Oh, well, it's about maybe 1/10 of what's happened in the East. Also, again, because of international conditions, people have been flying into Mirabel Airport and taking international flights. Like you mentioned, the Turks, the Jehovah's Witnesses, who were the Portuguese, and then the Tamils who came into Canada as a second country of asylum from Germany. And that also upset people. So those are large numbers. We've had possibly about 365 people, I believe, since January come through the Douglas crossing.
The local crossing. Now, who
Yes.
would they be? Would they be from El Salvador, Guatemala?
They're predominantly Central Americans, yes.
Central Americans. But they've been living and working with some security until recently in the United States.
Yeah, the Simpson-Rodino laws, or passage in the Senate, the American Senate, gives an amnesty to any illegal alien in the United States prior to 1982. And so somebody who's been in the country for 5 years can stay, can apply for get an amnesty and become a landed immigrant.
But those who have not been there since 82, who were late in coming up, what is their peril?
Well, they are going to be deported, and there's supposedly 5 million of those people that the Americans will deport.
And there will be punishment for anybody who employs them, jail sentences.
What they've done,
I saw somewhere.
Yes, they've effectively made employers extensions. They've become immigration officers or enforcement officers because within 1 year of the passage of that bill, I believe, which is in May, employers are going to have to be able to note all of their employers as residents.
Now, how many would there be of that post-1982 category who want to get into Canada from the States?
Well, theoretically, there may be half of them. There may be 2.5 million people who want to come into Canada.
2.5 million.
Yeah. But I don't know if anybody really wants to come. Any of those people really want to come. Well, some of them want to come to Canada. The majority of them want to go back to their own country. They want to go back to their own country.
When things are okay again.
They'd like to see that. And the United Nations position is, rather than resettling people into Canada, they'd rather see repatriation into their own country and the civil unrest over.
But some of these Central American companies have got 45, 50% unemployment.
Well, that's true, but that's a matter of also dealing with another problem.
So are we therefore, I get the feeling that perhaps we're being too hard on them. Maybe we should take 5,000 or 10,000 into BC.
Well, if we can handle that, certainly.
Can we?
Well, I'm not privy to the economic strength of the province, but I would
I
hope
can tell
that
you what it is. It's pretty poor.
Well, the unemployment, I would imagine, is around 25% in this province.
Well, no,
14. We say 14, but there's more people than that
Oh,
unemployed.
realistically, in many towns there are 20, 25, or even 30% unemployed.
Well, there's all kinds of people that just don't show up in any of those polls.
So therefore, the move by the Tory government in Ottawa to say you can only cross the border to have your hearing, and when you come across, you must go back and wait for your hearing. That was a good move.
Well, what it does is close the borders. But the problem with that is that there are lots of people who have no other choices, and we maintain within the refugee and immigrant serving community that these people should be served quickly, fairly, and sincerely by our government, and the others, what the media calls the bogus refugees, that they should be processed as well and being placed in an immigration stream and be handled on a fast track possibly. So
well, we wiped out the list of dangerous countries, the B1 list, didn't we?
That's right. The countries that we would deport to is gone. And that would mean, for example, we could deport to Moscow, and we could send somebody in a flight back to Moscow. And we'd say formerly, a refugee coming from Russia, there was no examination. We simply said, "Oh yeah, we understand the system there, so you have to."
What do we do for them when? No, first of all, maybe therefore we should send immigration officers down to Blaine, where some of these people are staying, give them a yes or no there, and get them off that particular hook.
Well, I think that's an international problem because we can't violate American sovereignty as well. We can't have operatives as a sense inside the United States.
No, they just come up. They come up here, and we process them then. And if we like them, if we think they're refugees, what are the criteria for a refugee? Is an economic migrant a refugee, and should he be allowed into the country?
Well, not under the existing regulations. The refugee definition is contingent upon the United Nations definition, the convention regulations that Canada is a signatory to, and there are people who are fearful for their own safety, for political reasons, for religion, for ethnicity, for and they fear that if they return to their homeland, then their lives are in danger.
But the 300 we've got in the border down here, I presume are by and large legit under that United Nations definition?
No, there are people who are claiming refugee status. We don't know what percentage of them are.
And when they come in here, who looks after them?
We have a network. The Vancouver Refugee Council is a coalition of about 30 organizations, church groups, and agencies that provide service, and they seek accommodation, and they provide interpreting and translation services.
And what government support do these refugees get at the moment they're in the country?
When they come through the border, they're detained at the border for an examination, and then they're given a date to come back. Once they return for their inquiry, and then they are allowed into the country, which is pretty well 100% of them. They're given a date for coming in to another examination where they present a statement under oath, and a document is provided to them which states that the federal government will not provide support, and that makes them eligible for hardship allowance under the provincial regulations, and so they receive funds for their and support for themselves if it's a.
And do they go on to Medicare at once?
Medicare can be on an emergency basis as well.
Well, good. I want to get your opinion if we're doing it, if we're being particularly hard-hearted or whatnot. And I'm going to take calls, too, to Stanley Knight, Chairman of the Vancouver Refugee Council, after the break. Yeah, it's nice. And I'm talking to Dr. Stanley Knight, the Chairman of the Vancouver Refugee Council. So there are some people waiting down in Blaine to get their appointments for hearing at the border, correct?
Yes, sir.
How many?
It's estimated there are about 300 from Blaine through to Seattle. Right?
There are some people who are lucky enough sometimes to come straight through, get their Wednesday appointment, and stay in Canada.
No, not anymore. There's a waiting period. You can't do that.
And then there are some people who can walk across the golf course, come down, and go into immigration in downtown Vancouver, skipping the border altogether.
There are some people doing that, yes.
And they're accepted right away.
I understand they process them in the normal manner. They just aren't sent back.
But didn't you say earlier that nobody gets sent back?
Canada doesn't deport. That's one of the reasons we have the problem we have. We've never deported anybody. And the Americans have deported about 600 people a month. And if they're going to chase after the 5 million people that are illegals in their country, and if they increase that even to 2,000 a month, they're still going to be a long way behind. It's going to take them several years to do that, and 50 or 60,000 a night come into the country.
The only reason the Minister of Immigration put up this temporary block at the border was to make things look better from a public relations deal.
Possibly, but I think that's going to stand. I think Canada's border will stand the way it is right now. I think they will no longer allow people to come in. They're going to detain. They will continue to do that.
And those who should have the priority are the legitimate refugees.
Well, certainly. Canada is a very humanitarian country. We have a long-standing history. You're an immigrant. My family were immigrants, and we hear from throughout the community that there's great support for that humanitarian tradition.
Well, employment's a bit of a problem here.
Well,
Don't you find some resentment against the brand new immigrants taking jobs? If they can find one, God knows they can't find one.
Well, whose job are they going to take? Are they going to take your job? Like, I'm articulate and bright and smart and clever. I'm not going to take your job.
Might they take somebody else's job, or are there just no jobs there?
Well, the jobs that they're doing, the jobs that many people will do, who come in as refugees, many people aren't doing anyhow or won't do. And
you mean Canadians won't do them for $4 an hour?
Similar to, there are many people who argue that the 5 million people won't come out of the United States because they need those people doing the jobs, the farm workers and others. If they're deported or they leave, the whole southern states will collapse because they have all that cheap labor.
Do we get many Mexicans coming up through, or do they generally stay in the States?
We have some who come in and claim that they're Guatemalans in El Salvador.
But a Mexican is not a political refugee, is he?
He shouldn't be at this stage, no.
Go ahead, please.
Hello, Jack.
Yes.
I'd like to ask about the people coming in and them getting medical coverage. Now, I have the milk of human kindness in my heart and all that, but my mom was born in New West. I was, my daughter was, and her 4-year-old daughter, and she came down from the north.
No, don't give me the whole family history.
I'm trying to say that she could not get any help. She was on unemployment. Now she has a job, but she still has not got the coverage. And I'm just wondering if they get that, just walk over the border, would she be better to go into Blaine and then just believe that she can't speak English? And there's one other thing.
Okay, that's enough for that one.
I don't have an answer for that. I think that it's unfortunate that this woman's family has that problem, but the refugees aren't ripping off the medical system, if that's what she's saying.
Could I please say
just a minute? Yes, of course you can. Just a minute. In Ontario and Quebec, they go straight on to the MSP. They don't do it here, apparently.
I don't know. I'm sorry, I don't have an exact answer.
Okay, last point, ma'am.
My first cousin is a doctor, and he worked in London, Dusseldorf, Rome, Lisbon, and Copenhagen, and everyone had to come through a medical exam. And I'm wondering, is that gone by the boards?
Immigrants and refugees eventually are, well, all immigrants have medical examinations. The documentation for refugees here includes photographs and fingerprinting for security reasons, and eventually they certainly will be involved in medical examinations.
Go ahead.
Are here.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, Jack?
Yeah.
Good night. Like you two, I'm an old immigrant too, in my age group, 56 to 60. I'm a bit upset about this. We've had refugees from the economical side of this province for the last 4 or 5 years, and I think we should be looking after our own people.
Okay, that's a blunt statement from an old Scotsman.
Certainly. Does he want a response from me? I'm sure you look after everybody. I think you look after your own people, and
Go ahead,
you
please.
look after others.
Yeah, I'm just, the Medicare thing. I returned from a bit of a stint abroad for about 10 months, and I had a 3-month waiting period. And I've recently gone to school, and I'm a qualified person. I can't find a job. I'm on welfare. And if I don't pay my $126 medical fee for the next 3 months, I'm cut off, my wife and my baby girl. And we have no recourse whatsoever. And I just find it amazing that the refugees can get emergency Medicare. What about me? Thank you.
Well, again, maybe there's somebody out there who's listening who's part of the Refugee Council who has an answer to that. I understand that there's emergency medical assistance. There are a number of doctors and others around town who provide emergency assistance, and the other side of that, people being denied assistance. That's if you're on welfare, you put money into your medical program, I guess.
But you're not. Well, there's no great problem in Vancouver at the moment housing the refugees that come here.
We've got an excellent network of people who are providing accommodation right now, and we can use more because we anticipate there'll be more people coming.
Accommodation in their own houses?
They are putting people up in their own houses, and then as funds become available, they're also looking at rentals. But low-cost housing is a problem in Vancouver because at the rates that these people can afford and the funds are provided them.
And of course, there are lots of people who have been here a long time waiting for low-cost housing too.
Certainly there are, yes.
Go ahead, please.
Yes, I'd just like to say I have someone I know who works in immigration. And, of course, when you work for immigration, you can't say anything against the government, so you can't call these shows or write your newspaper or do anything about it. But from what they've told me is that once a person, Canada's a standard joke. When they get to the border, they say, "Are you a refugee?" And they nod their head yes, and that's it, and they get in the country. And it's just unbelievable, the stories she has told me, that a lot of people are criminals that are coming in that are supposedly refugees.
Well.
And, I mean, do you keep stats on that? How many people are refugees? And I'd like to know that. And also, people don't realize what are going on. They get into the country, they get an allowance, they can go down and go to the Army and Navy and buy themselves all kinds of clothes. They get housing and medical and dental and everything they want. And they stay in the country for about 3 years. Till their trial date comes up, and then it's determined whether or not they're a refugee. And if they're not a refugee, they get to stay anyway.
Yeah, well, I'm afraid there's a fair amount of that. I don't think the benefits are quite as widespread as she says they are.
No, and that's one of the reasons why the government has made the changes they have. But also, that's an extreme case that she is presenting, and I'm not sure what the trade-off of that is. I mean, does that mean we're supposed to have these people walking around with rags and saying, "There go our refugees," and we're going to process them and find out what we're going to do with them? I think that, again, our tradition is to try and help people.
That's right. If only we had a government which would say and put its policies clearly and keep to its policies, and if necessary set numbers and quotas and say, that's it. then people will realize what they're facing.
So you had Mr. Markey with you on Friday, and he says some of the same thing as Mr. Weiner does. Mr. Weiner put out a press release, and he will be your guest on the 21st, I believe, of April. They say the same. They say the same things, and yet we don't seem to get a strong collective voice from the government officials that they're trying to do that, but it's very slow coming.
Well, it's been a problem for the last 25 years. I mean, how many amnesties have we given?
I guess that's
I can
true.
think of 5 or 6 myself. Why waste time? Why not just let them in and forget the amnesty?
Well, or else process them in some more efficient manner. We had 23,000 files that were processed and given an amnesty last spring, and now there's 21,000 people in the backlog waiting to be processed.
It's comic opera, isn't it? Because you can't process them, you just got to give them an amnesty.
Even you and I would take a few weeks doing that, right?
Yeah. Go ahead, please.
Oh, Jack, listen, I have nothing against these refugees coming in at all, but I feel this way. I see these people every day here in our own city lined up here with getting bags of groceries and everything else. I feel that before we bring any more people in, why aren't we helping our own people to get them off of these damn bread lines?
It's an obvious automatic human point, you know, to think, why let the refugees in when we've still got bread lines?
I agree with them 100%, but because we can't solve that problem, we shouldn't blame the refugees. We've got all the talent, we've got all the people, we can solve that problem if we have the will, so why blame the refugees for that?
My thanks to anything I can do for you, anything you want to collect for the refugees.
Well, I think that if anybody who is out there who wants to provide accommodation or assistance, who is bilingual, especially in the Spanish language, who wants to volunteer, the Inland Refugee Society is always...
Well, I'll do some more calls with you after the break. Take a break and
always
come
willing
back with
to
more calls.
receive help. Thank you.
I think it's fair to say, Stanley, that this refugee problem, well, we haven't a great one at the moment on the West Coast, puts an awful lot of decent people in an awkward kind of position, you know. We all know the scores of rackets that have been running immigration in this country since time immemorial with the amnesties. Few little people want to get in, and other people are complaining of the food banks, the jobs are being taken, and the housing. You can't blame them, can you?
Well, understandably, people are upset, but again, I think it presses us to think about Canada's future and also look at the country we have and how we can maintain our humanitarian zeal. How can we help our fellow man who is in a less fortunate situation than us? And how can we maintain our own, what we have?
Don't you think family unification has been overdone a bit? I mean, for every refugee that comes in, if we say bring in 40,000 refugees this year, you can bet there'll be 20,000 or 200,000 family unification applications next year.
Yes, and that's being adjudicated. I think they're trying to stay very, the close family, like mothers and fathers and brothers rather than cousins.
Siblings, mothers and fathers, and sometimes the mothers and fathers just bring the siblings here as courier parents, and then they go back to whence they came.
Yeah, that has been done. I don't have any answers for that.
Oh no, there's been a lot of that done.
Yeah.
That's why
it has been
perhaps
done, yes.
the average Canadian in the street is a little bit jaded on the subject of sympathy, even though he's a nice, decent. Somebody called me brash but compassionate today, and I think I am brash and compassionate. But the immigration record of the two major parties in this country has been an abomination.
Well, that's the difference. That's the historical difference.
Go ahead, please.
Well, Jack, I wondered why your guest's organisation has to provide these services, which presumably should be provided by the government. And secondly, aren't so many of us overlooking the fact that an immigrant produces more in his or her lifetime than he or she consumes? There's a very positive side to letting them in.
Fair enough. I think you would agree with that?
Certainly, yes.
Go ahead from Abbotsford.
Hello. I'd just like to say that I know single people that are on welfare receiving $350 a month, which isn't enough for shelter, never mind food. And, I have nothing against letting the immigrants in, but I think we should take care of our own first. There's also people on Social Security eating pet food. We got to get our priorities straight in this country. Thank you.
Thank you. That pet food thing's an old story which has rollicked around for a long while, and I don't believe it. Go ahead, please.
Oh, yes, Mr. Knight. I get the impression that we're not doing enough in pressuring the United Nations to take more immigrants or to find places for them. We seem to be, the United Nations seems to be on our backs. The immigration lawyers are on Canada's back, and special interest groups are on Canada's back to take more immigrants, but the rest of the country just standing around doing almost nothing, and they have less unemployment than we have.
Well, Canada is one of the top 5 refugee-receiving nations in the world.
That's what I just said.
Yeah. So we do an excellent job of that.
I'm not disputing that. What I'm saying is that it seems that the United Nations is always on us to take more refugees. Why don't they find other places that will take the refugees also?
Well,
because we can't possibly take them all. Let's face it.
Well, certainly we can't do that, but we can take more.
How many more?
I don't know, but I'm sure we can take.
Well, if you don't know, then who does? You're the one that's stating their cause.
There are people who work professionally in the area, the immigration officers and government economists. Mr. Wilson, the Minister of Finance, says that we need a population of 35 to 40 million people by the year 2000. That means we're 10 to 15 million people short. Where are we going to get them? Our birth rate's
We better
down.
start looking at the quality of our population also.
Well, how do you maintain the quality of life when you have an aging population? People are saying that Mr. Wilson maintains within the cabinet of the government that there's a need for more people. We need.
They have to be refugees. English people and German people can't get their mothers and fathers into Canada.
Well, I'm only saying that there's a need for more people in Canada, and that includes immigrants as well as refugees.
I never hear you saying anything about people from Europe that want to come to Canada.
I understand a lot of people in Europe don't want to come to Canada.
A lot of people do. There are
jobs
a lot of people in England, for instance, that want to
then
come to
Canada.
Canada.
Then they should come to Canada.
And I agree with that woman that phoned up regarding the immigration department. I know stories right from the horse's mouth that would curl your hair.
Well,
good. Sure. Of course, there are political elements involved too in the reunification and all the rest of it. And maybe we can do it. We certainly haven't done much in the way of leadership from any government that you or I can remember, can you?
Well, the problem is that we don't have the leadership. I agree. We don't have people who are aggressive about what Canada is, what Canada can become.
What we're going to do with them, or about the proper housing and services for the people we bring in as refugees, or even at certain levels as immigrants. Go ahead, please.
Yes, hello. I'm a landed immigrant myself. My father came over and brought me over when I was quite young from England. Now, I was wondering, the old joke, if you can't get it done by a Canadian, go get an East Indian to do it, and he'll do it for $2 an hour. Now, how are we supposed to have a minimum wage at $4 an hour when we're hiring guys at $2, $2.50?
Well, we have a minimum wage at $4 an hour, and anybody who doesn't pay it is breaking the law.
Yeah, but all these people, all these refugees are taking these $2.50 an hour. They're not.
Oh, I don't know about that.
I don't think that's true.
Hey?
No, they aren't. The McDonald's is paying less than minimum wage, I think. So I don't see too many refugees.
No, they pay the minimum wage.
Are they paying minimum wage?
Yeah, there are ages up to younger, and then it comes to $4. Go ahead, please.
Yes, Mr. Webster. Mr. Knight, I'm sorry to bother you here. My question is, Mr. Knight, there about why are we letting so many in, for one? You know, I know I have relatives that are unable to get jobs. My brother, for example, went down to Manpower. He was 24, 25, and less.
Oh, just a minute. I'm out of time. I can't answer that question. My thanks to Stanley Knight from the Vancouver Refugee Council, who is also an appointee to the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. I'm sure there's lots of compassion out there as well, but thanks for your contribution after the break.
Thank you.
Tomorrow night, a cheery subject. The Tories are bringing a motion into the House of Commons on capital punishment. 3 top-flight panelists, pro and con, tomorrow. It's a Fatah, David Williams, Michael Jackson tomorrow at 5 p.m. precisely.